You can do that. Ms. Jolibois, seconded by Ms. Boutin-Sweet, moves that Bill C-369, an act to amend the Bills of Exchange Act, the Interpretation Act, the Canada Labour Code, National Indigenous Peoples Day, be now read a third time and do pass. Debate. The Honourable Member for Desnatane, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, today is indeed a good day. Today I'm proud to rise on behalf of my constituents in Desnatane, Mississippi, Churchill River to present my private member's bill for one last time in the House of Commons. This was a journey that began what feels like ages ago, and there is a sense of comfort as this stage of our work together on this comes to an end. It is not lost on me, and it should not be lost on all our honourable colleagues in Parliament, that it was not too far from here that Canada's system of residential schools was created. It was in these halls that political leaders from across Canada decided that the cultures of First Nations, Métis and Inuit people had no place in Canada. It was in the chambers, not too far from here, that leaders spoke for hours about how First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people were not deserving enough to speak their own languages. And not too far from here, a Canadian Prime Minister stood with the backing of his party and decided that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people needed to be silenced, separated, and struck down. And today I stand here with a small amount of pride and a great amount of humility, knowing that history is back on the course of justice. Today is the result of countless hours of consultation with my elders, with my constituents, and with the history of our people. Today is another step towards our multi-partisan effort to fulfill the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 80. Today's bill is the product of a multi-party effort to best honor the legacy of residential schools, to honor survivors, and to think about how to do right by Indigenous people in Canada for generations to come. I do want to thank the members of the Canadian Heritage Committee for the thoughtful consideration and time they put into making my bill happen. No single individual or political party can claim ownership of how we proceed on our path towards true reconciliation. Reconciliation is a goal that we all have an obligation to work towards and reflect on. This includes not only us as members of Parliament, but also our staff and everyone who works for the Government of Canada. My bill would affect those of us in the federal service, because it was this government that decided to persecute and oppress the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across Canada. It is a tragedy that we all must atone for, and we must all work together towards fixing the systemic racism that is so commonly found in Canada's colonial government. Mr. Speaker, I do not want to give the impression that today is the end of our journey towards reconciliation. In the grand scheme of things, we have achieved very little on our journey. Everyone will shake hands and pat each other's backs after today, just as they did after the Heritage Committee, and claim victory in the name of political points. But working on reconciliation is not a political platform. It is a moral obligation to do the right thing. It is also worth noting that our work on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is far from over. When I first proposed my bill, it was clear to me after my consultations that June 21st should be a statutory holiday. June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day, is a day that has been chosen by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada because there is a spiritual significance for many related to the summer solstice. Knowing this, the Government of Canada funds nationwide celebrations from coast to coast to coast. This government provides the funding for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to publicly celebrate who they are, where they come from, and where they will be tomorrow. These celebrations would take place anyways. but that the government has a system for non-Indigenous people to participate in our celebrations is well thought out and welcome. But such a funding system is not currently in place for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This government has made a public commitment to say that this holiday will be taking place this year, but we have yet to see any actions on what the government plans to do on this new holiday. This is particularly important because our intention was never to just give federal employees another day off of work. It was intended to be a day for federal employees to engage with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities that surround them so they can better understand the system of oppression that still exists. Mr. Speaker, an empty commitment from this government is not acceptable. Without clear guidance from this government, done with the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people, this holiday will mean nothing if federal employees are not engaged in a meaningful way with the history and legacy of residential schools. I, along with my colleagues in the New Democrats, call on all members of Parliament to put the work in and make sure this holiday is meaningful. There is also concern, Mr. Speaker, and I've heard this from a number of my constituents, that limiting this holiday to just employees at the federal government is not a comprehensive response to call to action number 80. I fully recognize the limits of the federal government, Mr. Speaker. We do not have the ability to legislate the provinces in this matter, but I do believe that we should do everything within our power to talk to our friends within the provincial governments to take up this call to action themselves. Mr. Speaker, it was not just the federal government who carried out the harm against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children in residential schools. Provincial education boards and employees were directly responsible for much of the harm that has been caused. Everyone who has a seat in this chamber has an obligation to reflect on this holiday, but also an obligation to have difficult conversations with their friends, with their families, and with their own elected representatives, so that all people across Canada will have the time to appropriately think about the impacts of residential schools that continue to be felt. We owe that to survivors, we owe that to victims, we owe that to Canada. My last concern is likely the most important concern that I have, Mr. Speaker, and it has to do with the scope of the holiday. I had first proposed June 21st as the date of this holiday because National Indigenous Peoples Day is inclusive of the overwhelming majority of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Canada. Changing the holiday to September 30th and renaming it to the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation isn't harmful on its own. But it does make me wonder about those Indigenous people who have had their culture taken from them by this federal government outside of residential schools. In particular, I think about the survivors of boarding schools and day schools who are still waiting for the government to listen to their stories. I think about all the children who are taken from their families as part of the 60 Scoop, forever taken from their families, their culture, and their languages. Yes, this Day of Reconciliation is good, but will it be inclusive of their truths and stories? I very much look forward to continuing to have these discussions with people across northern Saskatchewan, and I invite all members of Parliament to open their hearts and their ears and invite these stories to come into their lives. Mr. Speaker, I have expressed these concerns in the past to committee members, and they've provided me with assurance that these are conversations that the government wants to have. It is with great honor that I accept my job as a member of Parliament for Daysneth and Mississippi Churchill River to hold the government to account and make sure they meet the full intentions of what this holiday works so hard to achieve. It is not a small task, and it must be taken seriously and with the highest amount of respect. I will be watching, Indigenous people will be watching, and all of Canada will be watching. At this point, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the amendments to the bill and speak to why this bill should pass through this chamber and head over to the other place. When I introduced my bill here a few years ago, I had proposed that June 21st be the statutory holiday for reasons that I've outlined previously in my comments today. At that time, the Assembly of First Nations, the Congress for Aboriginal Peoples, the Government of the Northwest Territories, and many other prominent Indigenous organizations and people across this country all called for the creation of June 21st as the statutory holiday recognizing National Indigenous Peoples Day. I do not view amending this bill to September 30th as a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation as a bad thing, so long as the government adequately addressed the concerns that I've raised earlier in my comments. What I was hoping to achieve with my bill was to begin a national conversation about a holiday honoring survivors and the legacy of residential schools, and today's debate shows that this is something we have achieved. Together, I am very happy to see that the democratic process worked and that we had a public conversation through the committee process about this holiday. As the Minister of Heritage himself has said, imperfect bills are presented and amended through the committees of this House. That's how our democracy is supposed to work. And with regards to this bill, it has worked. At committee, we heard from elders, national Indigenous organizations, Indigenous Women's Organization, labor unions, the Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and a number of chiefs from across Canada. The overwhelming response from them was that September 30th should be a day of truth and reconciliation. There are a number of people across Canada who may be upset that this bill has been changed, and with you I emphasize, I put forward the best case I could for June 21st, a National Indigenous Peoples Day. But after a lot of thinking and a lot of consultation, we have, in my opinion, really and truly identified an appropriate date for this holiday to take place. My door is always open to continue having this conversation, because it is far from over, and it is my commitment to my constituents to always be there to listen. One of the best lessons I've taken away from this consultation process is the idea that there is a difference between days of celebration and days of mourning. June 21st, as an established day of celebration, has its place, and a day of truth and reconciliation cannot be included within existing celebrations. For this reason, I welcome the amendments to the bill. As I've said before, September 30th has become more and more recognized across the country as a day to reconcile with our history. In both Northern Saskatchewan and here in Ottawa, I was very encouraged to see so many people in orange shirts saying to the world that what happened to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and families was unacceptable. I'm also so encouraged by the work of others to improve the lives of Indigenous children across Canada. I'm inspired by people like Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who has dedicated so much of her life to working towards child welfare in Canada. I also think often about the work that elders, friendship centers, Indigenous culture camps, and educators do across the country to really bring young people back into the culture of their family. I think about Kevin Lewis, who runs a program like this in Northern Saskatchewan. I also think about the Indigenous activists in Canada who have fought so hard to make sure Indigenous voices are heard by this government. I think of the Indigenous women who refused to stay idle when the government threatened their land and Indigenous sovereignty. I think of the Stolen Sisters who remind us every day of generations of Indigenous women who continue to live on in our hearts. I think of people like Colleen Heal Cardinal, who works almost single-handedly to make sure survivors of the 60 Scoop see the justice that they are owed. Mr. Speaker, I say all this to remind the members of this House of the context in which our debate today takes place. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have been fighting so hard for so long for their people. To establish this day of truth and reconciliation is not to pat ourselves on the back, but to give ourselves the opportunity to learn more about their work and how we can incorporate their ideas so that Indigenous people can have justice, and to tell survivors of residential schools that what we have done to them will never happen again. The calls to action put forward by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are not a checklist of things to be achieved. Completing just one call to action is not a step towards progress. Until the day that all of the calls to action are completed, we have very little to celebrate. So today we feel good, but tomorrow we must work harder. Today we look towards a brighter future, but tomorrow we must work harder to make life better for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. On September 30th, we will remember and honor the past and future, but on every other day of the year, we must fight to reverse the injustices committed against the Indigenous people in Canada. Masicho. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Parliamentary Secretary reached out to me late last week about the possibility of changing my opportunity for a private member's business tonight with the member for Destiné, Miss Nippy Churchill River, I was extremely honored this opportunity to fast-track this private member's bill so that it can get before the Senate and have September 30th as the day for recognizing the truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is very important. We want to get this done before the House rises for the summer so that this year can be the first year it's commemorated. I want to thank the member, but I also want to ask her, she raised some very interesting points about action and requirements by the federal government to ensure that the day is meaningful. And if she could elaborate a little on the specific types of events that she would like to see federal workers engaged in so that they can participate in the truth and reconciliation process, I would love to hear more specific examples. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Destiné, Miss Nippy Churchill River.
Thank you very much. When I think about the day of September 30th, it is very significant to survivors of residential schools, as well as boarding schools and day school survivors. The meaning of reconciliation, the meaning of coming together, and the meaning of healing. Now is the time as we move forward. We reach out to the kids in schools across Canada, from public schools, provincially run schools, to reserves across Canada from the territories. This is the time where federal government can lead the way in what it means to build better relationships, to follow through with commitments as stated by the federal government, and to work really hard in continuing to improve relationships and lives of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, and I appreciate the words and the hard work of my colleague from Destiné, Mississippi, Churchill River. As she knows that there is some concerns that we have expressed on our side, and it's not to say that we don't appreciate and really value and honor the need for this holiday, but with the date, we now have Labor Day, we have the Day of National Reconciliation, and we're going to have Thanksgiving. This is all within a period of 6 weeks, statutory holidays. There's some very practical considerations, so I just want to ask why she didn't consider substitution, because we can't keep adding holidays. Perhaps there comes a time where we should look at existing holidays and say, you know what, they're not as relevant or as important as what's happening here. So I just put that forward to her in a more practical sense in terms of what might have been something that would have been helpful.
The Honourable Member for Destiné, Mississippi Churchill River.
Canada has a rich history when it comes to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. The history hasn't been kind to Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast. There is enough evidence that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across Canada have been harmed over and over and over again. The truth and reconciliation and the work that was done, when I hear about elders and young people and families across Canada wanting to heal and move on. We honor the past, and that's what was laid out in the Truth and Reconciliation, and when I hear from elders across Canada. It is a very important time in our Canadian history to truly honor First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across. And we, as Canadians, as a Canadian government, in the House of Commons, and in this area, we have to continue or start demonstrating that. Thank you.
Resuming debate.